Once a month, Dr. Kevin Kavanaqh comes in, visits with us for the hour, talks about different things relating to health care. Dr. Kavanaqh is retired ENT from Somerset, Kentucky, and also founder of an organization called Health Watch USA. Kevin, good morning.
Oh, good morning, Jack.
Health Watch USA, tell us about it and your upcoming conference, if you will, sir.
Well, Jack, we're a nonprofit organization that's a patient advocacy organization. We do a lot with transparency, meaning educating people to what the cost of medicine is and the quality of medicine. And we have a newsletter. So I do this radio show once a month, but we also have a yearly conference. And this conference we're very excited about. You can go to www.healthconference.org for more information, but we have two excellent speakers as keynotes. One is Casey Hickox. Casey is a registered nurse who is the nurse treating Ebola patients in Africa who came over and was placed into forced isolation, but yet didn't have any breakdown in protocols, and nor did she have any symptoms of having Ebola. And we also have one of the nurses, Brianna Aguilar, who is the registered nurse who took care of the Ebola patients down in Texas. And she will talk about some of the safety lapses and things that she thinks needs to be improved and what should have been done. And of course, that is a problem of the whole system. I don't want to implicate any hospital or healthcare. A lot of it had to do with protocols not being correct, even though the protocols were being followed that were out there. And so I think this should be a very, very interesting conference. And all of that will be capped off, I believe, by Peter Eisler, who is one of the lead medical reporters for USA Today, and he will talk about quality assurance in the healthcare system. So it should be quite interesting. It's open to the public. If you're a professional, you can get continuing education credits with it, and go to the healthconference.org for more information.
Healthconference.org. Before we introduce our guest this morning, sort of a follow-up from last month, it was just a gut-wrenching program last month, and it involved two doctors, man and wife. And for those who weren't with us last month, just kind of tell us what the show was about and the gist of it, if you will.
Well, it was about the problems with medical devices, and one specific example was the morcellator, which was used to grind up tissue in the cavity. It allows you to do surgery through very small incisions, but if you have an occult or an unknown cancer, it can spread or upstage this cancer. And unfortunately, that's what happened with Dr. Amy Reed, who's Dr. Norchasm's wife, and she was also on the show. We also talked about the side endoscopes briefly and the problems that they're having with spreading untreatable bacteria. And one of the updates, which happened last week, is the FBI launched investigations into the device manufacturers of both of these scopes, wanting to know what they knew about complications and when. And this, I think, is very telling because, one, the public can't assume that we have an adequate reporting system. We talk a lot about infections, but that also relates to medical devices. And also that when we start bringing guests onto the show, I try to really hit relevant guests and not be alarmist, but these are true problems. And problems that medicine at this point hasn't been able to correct itself. Morcellation has been done for decades, but yet just now attention's being brought to the harm that it has caused.
But the fact that you're saying that the FBI is investigating sounds like there may be it may be a criminal situation.
Well, and that's what it certainly sounds like to me. The implications there has to do with voluntarily reporting. If you know about problems, are you going to then voluntarily report those problems to the proper agencies? And there's been a lot of allegations in the literature that there have been delayed reportings on both of these devices. And they're just allegations. I'll have to see what happens, but the things that I've read have been fairly scary on what has been going on. One of the things that's quite disturbing is that there's not a good testing system for the vast majority of medical devices before they're used on patients. Whether it's implantable into the patient's body or whether it's a surgical tool, a lot of them go through this and approved by the 510K process. But what's even worse is that once they get on the market, there's not a good tracking system to detect problems once they arise. We've talked about this regarding infections, and the same thing exists with medical devices. So in this case, it is very important to be very concerned about these devices and ask your doctor numerous questions regarding their safety, their testing, can they be taken out, what happens when things go wrong. all of that is important to do.
So we've got a guest this morning who has been with us before, a wonderful guest, terrific author, and introduce her to our audience now, if you will, sir.
Yeah, this is Rosemary Gibson, and she's going to talk, and we'll talk about continuing education with healthcare professionals. And it kind of relates into the problems we've just been talking about, is how do you get this information and know that it's reliable? Even scientific literature has been criticized, for example, in The Lancet, which is the top medical journal, as being accurate a little over half the time. Maybe up to 50% of the articles are just rubbish that are being published. So it's quite difficult to stay up to date. And one of the things that Rosemary Gibson and I will be talking about is some of the problems and pitfalls and the developing protocols that are being used for continuing medical education and mandatory medical education, and also recertification, which means taking a test or being reevaluated.
Rosemary, good morning.
Good morning, Jack. Good morning, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be with you both.
Oh, good morning.
Same here. Thank you for being back with us. Go ahead, Kevin.
Ms. Gibson is a senior advisor for the Hastings Center. She has published numerous books and has received really acclaim for them. She had a huge award from the Medical Writers Association. She's published books on Wall of Silence and the Treatment Trap, and she's also a public director of the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education. So she is our expert today to talk about these issues. And Rosemary, thank you very much for coming back and coming on this show.
What is Hastings Foundation?
Jack, the Hastings Center is a nonprofit healthcare think tank around healthcare ethics. And so we do a deep dive on ethical issues in healthcare and make that information available to journalists and to healthcare providers. And we're based up in Garrison, New York.
I was going to ask you, I thought you were in the D.C. area. You're in New York, I see.
Yes, that's correct.
Tell us a bit of the history of Hastings Center.
It was started by, one of the founders was Dan Callahan, who did a lot of work on what are the ethics around end-of-life care and educating the public and journalists and professionals and helping them think through these really tough decisions about end-of-life care. But we also work on healthcare ethical issues around resource allocation, cost, and issues like that, Jack.
I see. Kevin?
Well, and I think that, all of this, again, relates to trying to get a more safe and more efficient healthcare process and experience for patients. What we've seen now with medical education is a lot of the safeguarding is done by both the medical boards and by something called the specialty boards. And Rosemary, why don't you tell us a little bit about the difference between those two boards and kind of what they do?
Sure. Well, if you're a patient and you're walking into a doctor's office, you may not know whether you're walking into the office of someone who is a master in his or her field, who's gone through what's board certification in their specialty, keeping up to date, taking a test every 10 years, or you could be walking into the office of someone who's never opened a book in 30 years. This is the difference that's out there. And in the second case, those physicians are licensed. They're licensed by their state, and states have different licensing requirements to renew those licenses every 3 or 4 or 5 years. And there are several states, fortunately Kentucky's not among them, but New York, Colorado, Montana, South Dakota, and Indiana, there's no requirement at all to keep up to date over the course of one's career. So you can be practicing for 30 years and never be required to open a book.
Wow. But that's not the case in Kentucky, fortunately.
No.
There's a requirement of, and Kevin, you'll know this, about 2 weeks a year of what's called continuing medical education. And that's self-study where physicians can take time and get credit for it for keeping up to date. But there are some limits with that. We're all humans, and doctors are humans like the rest of us, and we don't know what we don't know. So you might want to do self-study in areas where you think you need to buff up a bit. But what about emerging infections? If you're not aware of them, then you may not go look to study for that or go to a continuing education course on that. So what board certification does is it's in addition to licensing. It's voluntary, and you take a test every 10 years that's put together by your peers. It's really done within the profession itself, and it's a very important mark that you are trying to keep up to date.
So as a consumer, as a patient, if we're doctor shopping, should we ask, is he board certified or she board certified?
I think that's a good thing to do, but again, it's no guarantee. But it's better than if someone who just gets a license and doesn't keep up to date and isn't what I call independent verification that they are keeping up to date.
Yeah.
And those exams are tough every 10 years.
Yeah, and I really am a supporter of board certification. Yeah, I think that you'll find that many hospitals now, we've talked a lot about healthcare integration, employment of physicians, but they require board certification in order to be on their staff. So there's really, in that case, two licensing or two privileging organizations. One is your state medical board, and the other is the Board of Medical Specialties, and they will credential the individual specialties. And right now, everybody's in a medical specialty, whether it's a family practice or, I mean, it's
gotten
the
so,
GP is general practitioner is a dying dinosaur.
Dr. Kevin Kavanaqh is with us in the studio. Rosemary Gibson with the Hastings Center is with us on the phone, and we're talking about doctors and certifications and tests and so on. Do you know if your doctor, the doctor that you go to, whether he or she has been tested in the last 3 or 5 or 10 years, and that kind of thing? Kevin?
Well, yes, and that is a huge controversial point. I think that Rosemary will chime in on this, I'm sure, is whether or not that part of the certification of a doctor, or any professional, it doesn't just have to be a doctor, should involve taking a test or some sort of reevaluation. And this has been primarily focused on a written test. And although that sounds good on the front end, and it certainly is something that should be worked through, the implementation of that, at least this last year, has been fraught with a lot of controversy and I think lessons learned. Maybe Rosemary, you can chime in a little bit about what the experience of the American Board of Internal Medicine and on some of the trials and tribulations they've been going through with this process.
Oh, sure. There's a group of physicians who have come forward and said, we're not happy with the exam and the whole certification process. And they've been very outspoken and they're trying to create their own certification means. And rather than take a test that really is tough and assesses your knowledge every 10 years or so, there's some of them that have set up their own so-called certification bodies where you can pay $102 or $200 and not have to do anything and say that you're board certified.
Wow.
And that's really troubling. Now, some of them make the argument that because medicine is so specialized, any one test, even within a specialty like surgery, may not be relevant to the special things that they do. There could be some truth to that.
I was going to say, that sounds legitimate.
It does. At the same time, you don't know what you don't know. And there are some things that all physicians, and I think Kevin would agree with this, that these emerging infections, how to identify them, how they need to be treated. I think most people would say, because infections are so widespread, that every physician should know that. And they won't know it unless there's a mandatory required test that assesses whether they're actually keeping up to date. So that's some of the debate. But underneath that, Jack and Kevin, there's still a group of physicians that don't want anybody interfering with their practice of medicine. They got their license and they want to practice, and they don't want any third party, even members of their own profession, requiring them to take a test to see if they're up to date. And that's troubling from a public interest point of view.
Well, I think that right now, most of the people agree that some sort of recertification, when you say recertification, that's code for test, is coming down the pike. I do think there's a lot of concern over who controls the narrative to make sure that the test isn't written by people with conflicts of interest, for example, industry, that
pharmaceutical companies
and trying to push their drugs, et cetera, et cetera. And although that hasn't happened yet, that in the back of a lot of people's minds, they're concerned about that. So I do think that's important. And to make the test relevant. For example, you wouldn't want to have a cardiovascular surgeon who does atherosclerotic bypasses being asked about how to do tissue slides for transplant patients and how to read those. And that's the reason why sometimes these questions can be hard to make. So what you said is very important, that recertification is important, but certainly controlling the narrative and making sure the questions are relevant, as she said, about talking about infections and other illnesses that are relevant, is certainly something that should be done.
Dr. Kevin Kavanaqh is with us in the studio. Rosemary Gibson is on the phone with the Hastings Center, and we had a caller who didn't want to go on the air, Kevin, but asked if you would. She'd like to keep up with you and to give your website again, if you would.
It's www.healthconference.org.
Okay. Now, here's an email. This is an interesting one, and I'd like for you both to comment on it. This is from Ziggy. Ziggy is a regular listener and contributor to this program. It says the medical device industry is mostly owned and operated by the pharmaceutical companies, if my understanding is right. Do you agree?
Oh, no, they're a separate...
They are?
Yeah, they're a separate entity. There are some crossovers, obviously.
Okay.
Because these are large corporations, but if you're a conspiracy theorist and you look at what goes on in the pharmaceutical industry, the medical device industry would be, in your opinion, much worse. Because there's very, very little oversight. But they function a lot of times by the same playbook, and of course there's the same federal agency, the FDA, which is over both of them.
Couple more questions here, and then I'll let you both go ahead. The medical device industry thinks the best testing system is you, and I guess the guinea pigs. The medical device industry thinks no reporting at all is the best reporting system, so they can continue no pre-market testing. The physicians who install these medical devices are mostly surgeons who make their living doing surgery and don't have an incentive to report patient results related to device problems when it could lower their income by reducing the number of people desiring the surgery. Do you agree? Let me go on and finish, and then you can both comment. Board certification and licensing have not solved this problem, and physicians no longer take the Hippocratic Oath, so we should call it the hypocritic practice. Love the show, always listening. So what do you think about the
Well, there's a lot of points in there, obviously. The characterization of the medical device industry has certainly been one that a lot of the advocates and a lot of people think, and we've talked about this, of having very poor pre-market testing, very poor pre-market follow-up. I think it's close to 70% of the devices get approved through a 510K process, which doesn't require any pre-market testing. And so if you say people are used as guinea pigs, if I had a medical device placed in me, and I've had quite a few with my severe arthritis, and it wasn't pre-market tested and something went wrong, that would probably be one of the kindest adjectives that I would be saying regarding how I was being treated. And certainly, it is of concern, and this is something I think that needs to get corrected. Surgeons do make their money off of doing surgery. That's why they're surgeons, so I certainly would agree with that. Some do have a conflict of interest with the medical device industry, but not all do. And as she said, that voluntary reporting tends not to work, and we've seen this time and time again. But that's not just with the medicine. I mean, that's with a lot of times with your car industry. It's with grocery stores. Take any industry you can think of. Voluntarily reporting problems and mistakes tends to be something the human being just doesn't want to do. I mean, that's just throughout everything. And that's one of the reasons why we've been pushing for mandatory reporting, especially of infection.
What's your comment, Rosemary?
I totally agree about the challenges of the medical device industry and the conflicts of interest among physicians, who some of them get paid handsomely for using some of these devices that have not been tested in humans before they're put on the market. We are human guinea pigs. I'll also say that board certification is by no means any stamp of approval or substitute for being an ethical person.
Let's go back to the phones. This is Sarge. Hey, Sarge, good morning.
Good morning, yeah. I want to go back to the comment that this lady made. Sorry, I can't remember your name, but...
Rosemary.
Okay, Mary, I disagree with your position on the formation by private doctors of their own so-called boards for certification separate from the AMA. Who gives the AMA who made the AMA the ultimate authoritarian in this matter? The AMA has done a pitiful job job representing the American peoples as a health advocate. They have done a horrible job. Just look at the way they dealt with Obamacare, recommending that, and their involvement in that. They are snakes, and I don't blame Rand Paul for forming his own ophthalmology board. I think we call it leadership.
All right,
who makes you the ultimate authority? You're not a government.
Sarge, listen, hang on. Go ahead.
Yeah, the AMA has nothing to do with medical certification or the American Board of Medical Specialties. It's a separate organization.
In fact, the AMA has, at their meetings, their physicians have come out opposed to board certification.
So we're talking.
Yeah, this is completely
we're comparing apples and oranges.
Yeah, it's not nothing. They don't have anything to do with this. In fact, a minority of doctors even belong to the AMA, and they are not involved in board certification or any of this process to any sort of a large extent, other than some of their members may be on both, obviously. But
yeah,
those are apples and oranges.
Yeah. Go ahead, Kevin.
And I think that one of the things that you really have to look at is the two items that were passed by our state legislature over the past decades. One has to be mandatory HIV/AIDS education, and the other has to do with the drug problems in the CASPR plan and education on addiction and treatment of pain. And these were actually mandated by the state legislature. Now, I can tell you right now, being involved in trying to get just anything passed with infections, that it is hard to get something passed. And for the state legislature to take that action really, to me, signifies that they're saying, hey, something is wrong. We need to have some more guidance to this continuing education. And it really, I don't think, should be done at the level of the state legislature. I think it should be done at the level of the medical profession, where you have some tighter standards you have on these global issues that people need to have uniform education, some assurance that education is taking place in these areas, along with recertification. But again, it's not the very, very highly specific thing that won't be cross-applicable to many, many physicians.
Go back to the phones. Joe, good morning. Thanks for calling.
Well, they're talking about 10-year certification. I'm a commercial pilot. I get a physical every 6 months. I have to have a minimum of check ride, both physical and a instrument check ride annually, and they're alternated, so you get one about every 6 months. And the doctors are whining about something every 10 years. Well, let's get real. We got people's lives in our hands. I just don't understand it.
Well, Rosemary, what do you say to Joe?
Joe, you're absolutely right. When the public gets on an airplane, they feel some assurance that somebody is making sure that pilots are fit to fly. And I congratulate pilots for the high level of professionalism. But when you walk into a hospital or doctor's office, most people expect that somebody's minding the store, that somebody's assessing doctors, not just their knowledge, but whether they're competent. And we have some physicians out there that do a great job keeping up to date. But unfortunately, it's not true for everybody out there. We got to raise the floor so the public can be assured that no matter where they go, whichever doctor they see, that they're up to date and fit to practice and competent.
I agree with you. I think, I don't know what needs to be done. If nothing else, the malpractice insurance people ought to price these people that don't keep up out of business. You know, if you got to pay $1 million for your malpractice insurance, you're going to do what they tell.
That's right. Joe, you make a really great point. Some of the medical malpractice insurance companies are owned by the physicians themselves. And there can be physicians out there that have many, I'm talking about tens, even 10, 20, 30 medical malpractice claims and settlements. And they still get insured because we have the fox guarding the chicken coop. So that needs to change. But you're absolutely right.
That. Conflict of interest, they ought to outlaw it.
Thank you.
There's rules against conflict of interest.
I appreciate your call, Joe. Conflict of interest.
Well, yes, and that's something that's a huge issue, and he brought up some very interesting points. Let me just add that in August, we're going to have Dr. Leanna Wen on the show, too, who will talk about conflicts of interest and that physicians should disclose all conflicts of interest to their patients. And I think that'll be a very interesting guest speaker, and she has a TED Talk, which the users may want to view, which is very interesting. The other issue I think that he brought up, the caller, is that of surgeons, because surgeons are kind of like pilots in that it's hard to take a test to show that you could fly a plane or that you can do surgery. You really have to be observed in doing the task. And I can remember that, I think I was in my early 50s, and I went to get privileges at Central Baptist. And to their credit, one of the things I had to do, even though I had done maybe 5,000 tonsillectomies, was to have a preceptor while I was starting staff to make sure that I was able to do surgery correctly.
Is that right? That's interesting.
And this was at the time, and I was pretty impressed with that. Now, interestingly, at the same time, I was in charge of the continuing education and certification at one of the surgery centers and tried to invoke the same rules on one of the surgeons there, and just absolutely had I mean, you think like I was just asking for something that was simply immoral, irrational, everything else threatens lawsuits, and just went on. And so that was a very a bad experience. And of course, I pointed out that, look what I have to do up at Central Baptist. That's the way things should be. And
that sounds like ego to me, though.
Yeah, well, there's, that's not an uncommon problem in medicine, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And I think that this is going to be more and more, we'll be seeing this. But privileging and credentialing doesn't necessarily equate, especially with surgery, with competence. And you get into this a lot with the medical device issue of the Da Vinci robot, which is a device that works, but you have to be highly trained to use it. And who's responsible for the training? Is it the company? Is it the hospital? Is it the surgeon? And there have been a lot of patient harms that have occurred. And
what is that? Can you tell us what that is?
Well, it's a robot that people operate to do surgery. They can do surgery through very small holes. It can also eliminate tremors. Everybody has a tremor. It's just how big it is. Well, if it's a robot, it smooths that out, and you eliminate that. So you do very fine and precise surgery, but it's extremely difficult to work, and it takes training. And even though you can get very good outcomes, and maybe even better outcomes, you have to be highly trained and do it. And then who is responsible for this, and what is the training? And this robot is in almost all the hospitals right now, and it's not covered in a pre-certification. You can take a book test on how to operate a robot or how to do the surgery, but that's not going to equate to having the surgical skills to do it. It's like taking a test in college about art versus doing a painting. Painting and painting is two separate things. So surgery, there's a huge gap in that. And that's something that the best example I have on how to handle it is what has been done at Central Baptist.
Great.
And that's easy to fix.
Yeah. How do you fix it?
I wrote in Wall of Silence, a book on medical mistakes, that there were physicians who were asked to provide a videotape of a surgery, in this case it was bariatric surgery, and submit it for peer review. And guess what they found? No surprise.
What?
Big variation in the quality of the surgical skill, number one. And number two, the quality of the surgical skill. If you had a highly skilled surgeon, no surprise, the patient gets a better outcome. But we don't do this routinely. But it's possible to do. And Kevin is right. There's a lot of ego and cowboys out there that kind of want to do what they want to do, and they think they're doing well, and they might be, but they might not. And that's why we need this independent, objective assessment regularly, just like the gentleman who's the commercial pilot talked about.
Right.
And certainly when you look at overutilization, and this is one of the big issues that I think Rosemary is probably the foremost expert on, when to have operations is important. You can eliminate a ton of them. They are overutilized many times in many categories. So always get a second opinion and be sure that you know the risks involved and what the expected outcomes are in any surgery.
Rosemary, you're a terrific guest. Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jack.